A struggle over incriminating evidence rips apart downtown Los Angeles. According to eyewitnesses, several LAPD units have now arrived on the scene. Stay with Sky 5 for more details.
Hello and welcome everyone to Last Level Price. I'm Mr. Black, and this is Battlefield Hardline, the next AAA flagship shooter from EA, developed this time not by DICE, but by Visceral Games in collusion with DICE, whose closed beta I was lucky enough to get accepted into. Now, as such, this is not at all representative of the final, fully realized release version of the game, and should not be taken as such, but it is enough, I think, to judge whether or not one wants to see and play more of this game, and certainly enough to give EA and Visceral some critical feedback regarding it. Now, when word of this game was first leaked, and it was leaked, not announced at first, I heard a lot of talk that this was little more than just a reskinned Battlefield 4, and there were actually a couple of rather interesting theories making the rounds, one saying that this was actually an upcoming DLC for Battlefield 4, another, rather convincing, that this was just someone's rather clever user-generated mod for Battlefield 4. Well, now that the game has been officially announced, confirmed, and released into closed beta, those comparisons haven't really stopped. And to those making them, I have to say that I disagree. To call this game a reskinned Battlefield 4 is to give it too much credit. What do I mean by that? Well, allow me to demonstrate for you precisely what I mean throughout the entirety of this video. Battlefield Hardline represents EA and its developers' attempts to move beyond the tired modern military shooters that we've all been really tired of for quite a while now, at least with respect to its top-tier competitive games. The question is, have they succeeded in offering and delivering something new here, or is this just the cops and robbers reskin of an otherwise unchanged Battlefield like so many, myself included, have suspected this game of since the very moment we caught wind of it? Well, yes and no. As far as gameplay goes, there are two game modes available for the beta: Blood Money and Heist. Blood Money is actually rather interesting, it's something new, whereas Heist is really little more than just a reskinned Capture the Flag. And we'll start with the Blood Money game mode, and appropriately enough, inside of the very carpool garage featured in that leaked footage from a couple of weeks ago that I am still of the mind that we saw far too much too quickly of this game for that to have been an unintentional leak. Either that, or someone at Visceral doesn't really like Visceral and/or EA, and therefore released that footage, among others, to damage the game's marketing campaign before marketing could actually get control over it. But that's another issue entirely. As for the Blood Money game mode, it is actually deceptively simple yet entertaining in its premise. You'll notice on the map that there are 3 points: your vault, enemy vault, and money pile. The objective being each team vying for control in a race of resources of sorts to collect as much money as possible in $100,000 increments, carrying, I believe, a maximum of $500,000 at a shot from the money pile back to their respective vaults. And the first team to reach $5 collective million between the lot of them wins. And there's actually a great deal of strategic variety in how different teams can approach this. You can, of course, try to just race between your vault and the money pile to collect as much as possible and just win outright through brute force, or be a little bit more sneaky, like I like to be, and to rush the enemy vault, which is usually left relatively unguarded, seeing as everyone and their brother is trying to rush the money pile and rob them of their earnings, and in doing so, also boost your own. So you kind of double down in that sense, but if you do happen to bring down heat at the enemy vaults, considering the fact that they spawn there, you're not going to last long. So there's actually a great deal of fun in this game mode. Now, I make the distinction there between this being fun and being mechanically interesting and making sense, because this mode doesn't make a great deal of sense. If I'm playing as law enforcement, for instance, what am I doing here? Are we pretending that I'm stealing this money to protect it. Never mind the fact that these aren't vaults at all. These are armored vehicles. And yes, I know that's an argument of semantics, but semantics are what grant a game and a scenario its legitimacy, and this just doesn't make a lot of sense. Why are these armored vehicles even so far away from the money pile and not parked directly outside of the building? These are questions of the scenario that tend to knock one out of the experience and that demolish its legitimacy in terms of actually making sense within the scenario that we're presented with. Note too that in the little objective box down in the bottom left of the screen, it says that my objective is to secure evidence. Is that really what we're pretending I'm doing as an LEO in this scenario? Because I don't buy it. From a criminal perspective, this mode makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, it's the law enforcement aspect of it that falls through. The Blood Money game mode is an interesting sort of microcosm for my opinions of the game as a whole, which is to say that it is rather entertaining, but the issue of concept versus execution falls through. Now, Heist, on the other hand, actually makes a great deal more sense conceptually, even if it is just blown into Michael Bay-esque proportions of destruction and violence. But that's what makes Battlefield fun. Never mind the question of what loot is possibly worth decimating half of a city over. Unfortunately, it does little to actually embrace the game's concept uniquely either, instead coming off rather transparently as just a blatantly reskinned capture the flag mode. Fun, but not terribly inspired. And that really encapsulates a great deal of what's wrong with this game. It's that disconnect, that lack of cohesion between its concept and its execution. As for progression mechanics, this is going to look pleasantly familiar to any fan of the Battlefield franchise from any iteration of it. Weapons and equipment are unlocked as one levels, and new attachments and accessories for weapons and equipment are unlocked the more that one uses them. So this is by no means nothing new, but it doesn't need to be, because this system works and has worked for quite a long time now. There are a great deal of things in Battlefield Hardline that hold the game back. And chief amongst them, I think, are, ironically, the recycled assets and ideas from previous games in the Battlefield franchise. Take, for example, the classes. You've got the Operator, the Mechanic, the Enforcer, and the Professional. These are clearly just nominal renamings of otherwise familiar classic Battlefield classes. You've got your Assault Medic, you've got your Engineer, you've got your Support, and you've got your Recon. These classes are utterly unchanged. And again, touching upon the admittedly semantic argument of Visceral, I've got a question. Are none of these other officer classes, take for example again my playing a law enforcement agent here, are they not professionals? Are they not enforcers? Are they not all operators? I mean, what does that term even really mean in this context? Operator is usually a term reserved for designations of military or paramilitary staff. Just admit that you didn't know what to call it other than assault, because that would be too much like former Battlefield games. There is literally no other explanation for this naming convention. Other issues arise too when one really starts to take a look at the details of this game. Once again, the devil's always in them, and a few things really jumped out for me when I started playing this on a dedicated basis to get as good a look at this game as I could before reviewing it for you all. And chief amongst those are very probably the animations in this game. They are abrupt, they are jerky, they don't transition well from one to another, they look unnatural, they look uncomfortable. These animations don't look like real people. And what's more than that, they don't control like it either. The controls in this game are sluggish. Throughout this footage, those of you who have played a great deal of Battlefield may be wondering why I'm moving so slow. Why aren't I sprinting? I am! And there's not really a great deal of difference between just moving forward and holding shift to sprint forward. There's a very gradual gradient between moving from one speed to the other, and there's not much of an appreciable difference between them either. And again, it's that moving from one direction to another that just feels sluggish. And unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. In this game, as compared to previous Battlefield titles, bullets seem to have, inexplicably, a slower muzzle velocity than those that have come before. Weapons have a greater spread, a wider spread, than those that have come before. And I understand that the devil's advocate reasoning behind this is that they're trying to get across that these are not soldiers, like the characters have been in all of the previous Battlefield titles to date. These are career criminals, these are law enforcement officers. Yes, these men would be athletic, but they would not necessarily be trained or in the sort of shape to allow for the sorts of snap action and extreme speed and exertion that soldiers would. I get that idea, but it just doesn't come off that way when executed like this. Unfortunately, I don't feel like I'm moving the way that a cop would, like I'm moving the way that an athletic criminal would. I just feel like I'm playing a game with sluggish and unresponsive controls. So if it's the idea that I'm not playing a soldier that Visceral was trying to get through my head, I'm not receiving that message, especially when mechanics are equipped by default with one of these. In what world is this standard police issue? But Mr. Black, that's an issue of gameplay balance. There has to be an answer to the armored vehicles. True, but there are ways to do that without compromising concept. Take, for example, directed electromagnetics. Things that can immobilize and render useless any vehicle and are in the experimental testing phases with the LAPD right now. And while hardly as severe an offense, the remainder of this game's armory hardly makes better sense. The default sidearm, for example, of Tech 9s for criminals and cops alike is particularly mind-boggling. Why is this here? Because 80s media hype? To say nothing of the 38 snub-nose revolver sidearms for the operators. I mean, really? In today's age? What department in the country, I implore you, Visceral, to give me a solid answer here, still issues their patrolmen snub-nose revolvers? Revolvers of any sort at that rate. This should be a Glock. There is no debate here. Now, on the subject of realism, I know that this game isn't meant to be at all realistic, and that it's channeling more the spirit of Miami Vice, of Michael Bay, of Bad Boys 2, but I just think that a little more cops would do it some good. I mean, come on, Visceral. I mean, cops using Tech 9s, other cops using 38 snub-nose, even the RPG-7, I could begrudgingly understand to a degree, but SUVs and attack choppers mounted with miniguns? Are you for serious? And on a more serious note, yes, I get that there needs to be balance between the sides, and that criminals would be more likely to have these outlandishly destructive weapons. And yes, you do need to balance that from each side if you're going to have a solid and fair competitive shooting experience. I know that, I get that, I'm all for that. But you can have analogs from side to side. Have these things be, as I mentioned, you know, directed energy weapons, things like electromagnetics, things that can disable and essentially render useless as though they were destroyed enemy vehicles, targets, equipment, but that don't necessarily need to, once again, compromise the vision of the concept. Now, I recognize, mind you, that Battlefield has never really striven for realism, and I recognize, too, that I take particularly poignant offense at these errors because of my having lived, worked, and been raised around cops. But at least with a military shooter, such wanton destruction is at least somewhat believable. It's happened before, if not quite on such scale, but when was the last time you ever heard of a cop discharging an RPG-7 inside of a city? Anywhere. For any reason. Go on. I'll wait. Right. And the sad thing is, there was actually real potential for this concept. When I first heard of this game, I was cautiously hopeful that they might actually tap some of that potential and come up with a concept that actually made some sense. Like pitting the DEA or the FBI against cartels along the border or south of it, as a lot of action narratives have wanted to do, taking the fight to the cartels in recent stories, or GSG-9 combating domestic terror groups in Europe, or hell, they could have even gone above and beyond and made every map represent a unique conflict between different law enforcement and criminal elements from around the world, and that could have been awesome! I know it would have taken a great deal of research and a greater number of textures and models and assets to make the uniforms correct, to make it look believable, to make them look unique, but to say that that would be too much work would be Ubisoft levels of ridiculous at this stage. And speaking of assets, does this look next-gen to you? I know, I'm playing this on PC, but remember, this game is slated for release not just on PC, but also on the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. This is unacceptable for that standard, and hardly makes use at all of the powerful Frostbite engine that this is running on. I played Battlefield 3, not 4, this morning to give myself a proper gauge by which to compare this game to what's come before. And that game, released back in 2011, looked better! I know there's no such thing as next-gen as relates to PC consumers, but there is nothing next-gen about this game for console consumers. Now, I know I'm being hard on this game, and I know already that there are going to be a slew of comments telling me that I already made my mind up about this game before I ever walked into it. Well, not so much. My livestream viewers as my witness, the lot of you are well aware that I gave this game its fair shot. I gave it the benefit of the doubt, and I checked my bias at the door when I walked in to the very best of my ability. I gave it time, I gave it a chance, I gave it multiple chances, thinking that the things that were annoying me right off the bat were just the product of it being a beta, the little flaws that are to be expected when a game is not yet finished. But the more I played, the more I found that these issues were a bit more endemic than first glance would lead one to believe. Oh, and by the way, Visceral, I would really love it if Battlelog, which yes, this game does once again use, didn't connect me to European servers half the time when I live in Houston, Texas, and then connect me to matches that are either nearing completion or wrapping at the time, the rest of the time. A few old features do make much more positive returns, though, so I've got to give credit where it's due, and I think the most impressive amongst the old guard of Battlefield features returning here is the Levolution function from Battlefield 4, and to a limited degree 3, with its very malleable, destructive environments, allowing for dynamic changes to the map mid-match. A handful of other new features like tasers, zip lines, grappling hooks, those all start down the right sort of path, and they're all really nice touches in their own right. But on their own, they just don't carry this game far enough to really even start to stand on its own. Overall, the game just feels half-finished. It feels rushed, like a disingenuous attempt at actually realizing its own concept. And once again, I suspect the heavy hand of EA rushing this game to release, especially once word of it was compromised. But at the end of the day, no small amount of responsibility still lies with Visceral for their lack of conviction in fully investing in their concept. I would call Battlefield Hardline the reskinned Battlefield 4 that so many before me have, but unfortunately, it's even less than that. Honestly, I would have expected more from the developer that brought us Dead Space, if not Army of Two. EA, you left your flagship AAA shooter franchise in the hands of Visceral Games, and this is what they've done to it. Were it my IP, I would be furious. I know that DICE is busy with Mirror's Edge 2 and with the Battlefront reboot, but I would rather see a delayed release for Battlefield 5 or even for Battlefield Hardline, the real edition, than to let Visceral have their way with this concept any longer. I know business is business, and I know it's EA's traditional practice to release iterative games on a semi-annual basis, especially with regard to their sports titles, but also with regard to their competitive shooters like this, and they have to get something out. But this game, as it stands right now, if it does not see dramatic improvement from beta to release, will damage consumer faith in the Battlefield franchise for many titles to come. This will not go away with the release of the Battlefield 5 that we all know is coming eventually. I would rather see this entire game get canned and perhaps rebooted later once DICE can get back to the Battlefield franchise than allow this game to damage the future of this franchise further. Now, all of that said, do I want to see this game fail? Do I want to see EA take a massive profit hit? Do I want to see Visceral lose face and lose credibility or go out of business? No, no, and absolutely not. It is my place as a games journalist, as a critic, and as someone who cares about games to give tough love like this to developers and publishers like this, so that they can become better than themselves and so that they do not torpedo their own progress. They need to be called on it when they're doing things wrong. And this is doing something wrong. I recognize that, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, this is nothing more than the beta of this game. But by this time, these things should have been corrected. By beta, many of the things that I have cited as problems, as critiques with this game should have already been ironed out. Those kinks should be gone. Those problems are, by the reckoning of this, not going away. They may only see additional features added on that will cloud the issue, but a lot of the core problems at work here would take an entire systemic reboot from this concept to correct. And unfortunately, I just don't see that happening. So once again, I've got rather mixed feelings when it comes to this game as pertains to it acting as a harbinger for dark times in the Battlefield franchise's future. Hopefully, DICE can once again in the future return to this franchise after they've finished Mirror's Edge 2, which does look to be shaping up quite well, after they have finished the Battlefront reboot, which looks absolutely stellar in terms of its visuals, certainly better than what we're seeing here. And I look forward to that day, because that may very well be the reclamation of the Battlefield franchise's future. But until then, I am Mr. Black here at Last Level Press. These have been my thoughts, of a critical level at least. You can look forward to seeing more gameplay of Battlefield Hardline. I am Mr. Black here at Last Level Press, and as always, I wish you all good gaming and Godspeed. What was that? What's with the boink? Boink?